Welcome to Roots of the CLT, Chapter 4. I'm John Davis, the producer and narrator for this presentation, commissioned by the National CLT Network. Previously, we reviewed the defining features of the classic CLT and traced the development of the model's distinctive approach to ownership and organization. In Chapter 4, we're going to look at the T in CLT, examining the origins and evolution of the model's distinctive approach to operation, who the CLT serves, and what it does with the lands and buildings entrusted to it. Three operational commitments are common to nearly every community land trust. They were introduced in Chapter 1. Let's see where they came from. The authors of the 1972 CLT book had chosen trust for the name of their new model to emphasize Borsodi's idea of trusterty. Remember, for him, land was not to be treated as individual property. It was part of the commons, a shared resource to be owned and managed on behalf of what Bob Swan and his colleagues called the community of all mankind. This emphasis on common ownership held great appeal for a back to the land movement that was gathering steam at the time. Homesteaders and middle-class communards established a number of intentional communities on leased land and called them community land trusts. They were clearly inspired by the book that Swan had helped to write, but they embraced neither the open membership nor the inclusive board he had advocated. Swan himself referred to these collectives of like-minded individuals as enclaves, refusing to call them community land trusts. In the beginning of the 1980s, however, a new crop of nonprofits began to emerge that incorporated both the leased land structure of ownership and the community-based structure of organization of the classic CLT. At the same time, they pointed the way toward operational features that had been missing or muted in the 1972 book, nudging the model in a new direction. For these new CLTs, the community for whom land was being held in trust was not all mankind, but a disadvantaged subset, people excluded from the economic and political mainstream. In the language of the liberation theology of that era, there was a preferential option for the poor. Increasingly, the T in CLT was conceptualized and operationalized in ways much closer to Gandhi's notion of trusteeship than to Borsodi's notion of trusterty. One of the first organizations to take the CLT in this new direction was the Woodland Community Land Trust. It was founded by a former nun, Marie Cirillo, who had moved to the coal fields of East Tennessee in 1967 to work as a community organizer. She soon saw that the only way that her Appalachian neighbors were going to improve their lives was to gain control over some of the land in their valley, almost all of which was in the hands of absentee corporate owners. Twice she helped to bring Bob Swan to East Tennessee to talk about community land trust, but he failed to spark much interest among people with a healthy skepticism about land leasing. After all, many of them were already living on land owned by a land company or coal company, an experience marked by exploitation and insecurity. But Marie persisted, eventually persuading her neighbors to give the CLT a try. When the Woodland CLT got going at last, it purchased land, built its first houses, and did something different than the intentional communities that were calling themselves land trusts. Woodland opened its board to people not living on its land and imposed resale controls on its newly constructed houses. Around the same time, a Carmelite nun named Lucy Poulin was helping to create another CLT in northern Maine. She and several other sisters had moved to Hancock County in 1968, supporting themselves by sewing shoes for a local manufacturer. When the company closed, over 30 women, including the nuns, were suddenly out of work. In response, the sisters helped to form a sewing cooperative, selling crafts to tourists through a storefront they opened on US 1. They established a school and daycare center for the co-op's members, and they began Project Woodstove to deliver firewood to the elderly. Their next project was affordable housing. Sister Lucy took the lead in forming Self-Help Family Farms in 1978, along with the Covenant Community Land Trust. Each family was sold a newly built house on a 10-acre leasehold. Priority was given to the rural poor of Hancock County. One of my favorite pictures of Sister Lucy is this one. Nuns with chainsaws. Probably not the image you had in mind on hearing that these first CLTs were led by women with ties to religious communities. The first urban CLT was the Community Land Cooperative of Cincinnati, started by the West End Alliance of Churches and Ministries. The two alliance members playing the largest role in organizing this new CLT were Morris McCracken, a Presbyterian minister, and Barbara Wheeler, a Dominican sister of the sick poor. The Community Land Cooperative was created to be a bulwark against gentrification in a low-income African American neighborhood on the edge of the central business district. Its foresighted founders realized that removing land from the market would not go far enough. For the CLT to succeed in stopping speculation, preventing displacement, and preserving affordability, the buildings must be insulated from market pressures as well. From the beginning, therefore, the Community Land Cooperative imposed durable contractual controls on the resale price of all its homes. The person who introduced the CLT model to the Reverend McCracken and to many others was Chuck Mathai. He spent nearly 30 years traveling back and forth across the country in a series of beat-up second-hand cars, speaking about community land trust to any audience he could find. He convinced hundreds of people to stop talking about the CLT and go start one. If Bhave was the walking saint of the Gramdan movement in India, Mathai was the Johnny Appleseed of the CLT movement in America. Mathai grew up in an affluent suburb of Chicago. A brilliant student, he was accepted at Harvard, but he got sidetracked by reading a newsletter published by a group of anti-war activists in Cincinnati known as the Peacemakers. The heady blend of civil rights, economic justice, and pacifism highlighted in the Peacemakers newsletter was a moral concoction that Mathai found quite intoxicating. Graduating from high school in 1966, he hopped on his motorbike and headed to Cincinnati to meet the people he had been reading about: Ernest and Marion Bromley, Wally and Juanita Nelson, and Mac McCracken. To the fury of his father, he never made it to Harvard. Instead, following in the footsteps of his heroes in Cincinnati, Mathai became a lifelong pacifist and social activist. He lived for a while at the Catholic Worker House in New York City, becoming a personal friend of Dorothy Day. He later got to know Sister Lucy in Maine and became involved in her efforts to establish the Covenant CLT. In 1978, Mathai joined the board of the Institute for Community Economics. 1 year later, he was made ICE's executive director, accepting the princely salary of $300 per month. He moved the Institute from Boston to Greenfield, Massachusetts, and began building a sizable staff, all of whom were paid the same salary as their executive director. The people attracted to ICE and to the fledgling CLT movement of the 1980s brought a new set of sensibilities to the work. Some had ties to the Catholic Worker or to other faith-based organizations. Some had developed or financed affordable housing. Many had experience as community organizers. Mathai believed that a new generation of CLT activists must have its own blueprint for building a community land trust. He pulled together a 12-person team to produce a book that would update the model that Bob Swan and his colleagues had proposed a decade earlier. The Community Land Trust Handbook was published in 1982. Drawing on the experience of newer CLTs like those in Cincinnati, Maine, and Tennessee, while paying homage to the ongoing experiment at new communities, the CLT Handbook proposed several organizational and operational refinements. Especially important was the emphasis placed on urban applications and the elevation of stewardship as a central concern of the CLT. The CLT handbook was also quite explicit about who this model should serve, namely those who Sister Lucy had described as people who have never been accepted or had value in the larger community. What was new as well was an acknowledgement of the inevitable tension that exists between the legitimate interest of individuals and communities, especially on matters pertaining to security, legacy, and the allocation of equity, some of which is created by individual effort, and some of which is created by the investment and development of society, as John Stuart Mill and Henry George had pointed out. The CLT was extolled as a mechanism for effectively and equitably balancing these interests for the long-term benefit of individuals and communities alike. By 1982, therefore, all of the pieces had been put in place for the model of tenure that we know today as the classic CLT. An experimental hybrid was now ready for wider cultivation. From this point on, the number of CLTs in the United States began to grow, taking a steep turn upward in the 1980s. With a new emphasis on producing housing, preserving affordability, and addressing the plight of the poor, the CLT began to be adopted in a number of cities. Indeed, urban CLTs were to form the leading edge of CLT expansion in the coming years. Many of these CLTs were organized in opposition to municipal plans that threatened the displacement of low-income people. But here and there, CLTs got going with the direct support of city government, starting in Burlington and Syracuse. CLT development continued outside of cities as well, with many of these rural CLTs staking out a service area much larger than their urban counterparts. Pictured here are several scenes from the CLT on Orcas Island, including a picture in the upper left of one of Opal's founders and first leaseholders, Michael Sky. The 1980s also brought heartbreak. After struggling for 15 years to hold on to its land in the face of harassment and hardship, New Communities lost everything to foreclosure. This bold experiment in community ownership had had a lot going for it. It was blessed with leaders who were visionary and skilled. It was founded on a conceptual, political, and legal foundation that was to be replicated in most of the successful CLTs that followed. What was missing was money. Grants promised by the Office of Economic Opportunity were torpedoed by Lester Maddox, the racist governor of Georgia. The leaders of New Communities were forced to encumber their land with debt, turning reluctantly to the Farmers Home Administration, whose local administrator had declared that New Communities would get a loan over my dead body. FMHA finally did loan them money after damaging delays, but years of drought pushed New Communities and many other farmers to the brink of bankruptcy. Farmers Home foreclosed and the land was lost. But New Communities did not go away. Charles and Shirley Sherrod in particular did not go away. They joined a class action suit against USDA, alleging that their farming operation had been harmed by the discriminatory practices of the Farmers Home Administration. 10 years later, a federal judge agreed. New Communities was awarded $12 million in damages. So what did the Sherrods do with that money? They went looking for land. And in 2011, they found it, a plantation outside of Albany that had once been owned by the richest man in Georgia, who was also the owner of 100 slaves. In more recent decades, Cypress Pond Plantation had been a game reserve where wealthy gentlemen would come out to the country for a weekend of hunting and fishing on 1,600 acres of land and spend the night in an antebellum mansion or in one of 5 luxurious guest houses. Today, the descendants of slaves are the owners of this plantation. They are converting it back into a working farm, laying irrigation pipe and planting hundreds of trees, growing pecans and oranges. They are drafting a master plan for the use and development of the land and buildings. What they end up creating here may turn out to be quite different from what was envisioned for the first CLT over 40 years ago. But the dream hasn't died. In one guise or another, New Communities is coming back. As a young woman newly graduated from NYU in 1971, M. Tamanika Youngblood had moved from New York City to Southwest Georgia to work at New Communities. She later made a life for herself in Atlanta, helping to lead the effort to revitalize the King Historic District, among many other accomplishments. Today, she is the executive director of the New Communities and a recipient of the highest honor bestowed by the National CLT Network, an award named after Bob Swan and Chuck Mathai. She has spoken eloquently of the rise, fall, and recent rebirth of New Communities, drawing on one of Martin Luther King's favorite quotes. New Communities still has a long way to go. So does the CLT as a model and movement. Unconventional ideas like community ownership of land, the stewardship of housing, and a preferential option for the poor run against the grain of dominant ideologies and interests. We are likely to have a lengthy wait before the CLT is allowed to sit in the front of the bus in seats presently reserved for more privileged forms of tenure. But take heart, more improbable things have happened. Today, a city park in Albany, Georgia is named for an outside agitator who came to fight for civil rights and never left town. The federal courthouse is named for a local attorney who rarely won a case before the white judges and all-white juries of his day, but never backed down. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. This concludes the final chapter of Roots of the CLT. My thanks to the National CLT Network and to Kate Vickery for helping me to bring it to you. I hope that I've managed to whet your appetite to learn more about the remarkable cast of characters whose ideas and efforts gave rise to the Community Land Trust. There is more to be learned on another front as well. I've given you a glimpse into how the CLT got born. Equally important is the story of how the CLT grew up as an experimental model matured into a worldwide movement. But that is a tale for another day.